We're talking about it all the time. It's in the news every week. We hear about good Samaritans. But do we understand what that phrase actually means? What is a good Samaritan? Is it just, based on those headlines, I think what we can glean is that it's just a good person. Somebody, a stranger, who helps someone else. And that's true. That's part of what a good Samaritan is, but it is so much more than that. Amen. Jesus could have told this story and never invoked the name Samaritan, and could have taught us a lesson about being nice to other people. He could have taught us a lesson about being good to strangers. But he chose a very specific kind of person to single out as good. Now, you might have noticed this morning that we skipped something. Did anybody feel the tension this morning? What did we skip? I'll give you 5 bonus points if you can guess what it was. Chris? Our motto. Our mission statement. Yeah, our motto. Every Sunday, we repeat this thing. Right? Now you're like, oh yeah, we didn't do that this morning. Our mission here at Church in the Palms is to love God, love others, and live the love. That frames everything we do as a church. The decisions we make as leaders, the decisions we make as a staff, all run through the lens of, does this love God? Does it love other people? And is it a way in which we can live the love? And if it doesn't fit that criteria, we're probably not going to do it. But not only that, it frames the way we hope that all of us as a community will live out our faith. We want to inspire you to love God. We want to inspire you to love other people. We want to inspire you to live that love. Now, I have a secret. We did not come up with this. We did not sit down in a room and have this aha moment as we unpack Scripture and said, hey, I think there's a trend here. In fact, this is something that has been known from the beginning. When God gave the 10 Commandments, they were on 2 tablets. On 4 of them were commands about loving God. And on the other tablet was 6 about loving people. I don't think it took 5,000 years for somebody to figure that out. It has been known. If you walk into another church, we actually, on our way up to Georgia, we were playing a game. We had this road trip game where we were trying to find all the license plates. There's all these other things. And one of them was churches. So when we passed a church, we got really excited. Now, we didn't count the one that we passed on the way out of our neighborhood. We said we had to get on the highway for this. When you get to Georgia, there's a lot more churches. There's just everywhere. And a lot of them have this little phrase out front that says something like, love God, love people. Love God, love others. Love God, love one another. And I think, man, I'm going to have to file a trademark lawsuit. They're stealing our stuff. It's not original. We didn't come up with this. In fact, it was known from the beginning. And the parable of the Good Samaritan begins with a conversation about this very idea. What these words mean. In Luke chapter 10, 25 to 29, it says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. But the man wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? He knows the law. He knows the rules. But who do they apply to? I love the question that he asked at the beginning. What must I do to inherit eternal life? It's a great question that we should all ask. This is why studying the Bible is important and talking to other Christians is important, because because that's the kind of question that we should be asking. What do I need to do to live right? Amen. Now, there were two ways to understand the law in the Old Testament. There was a tradition that Jesus was a part of, and that most of the Pharisees and most of the common people were a part of, and that was the oral tradition of the law. You see, there were 611 Old Testament laws. But what Jesus and the Pharisees and most people believed was that those laws, those 611, weren't a full and all-encompassing set of rules. In fact, they were wisdom and guidance for us to build off of. That we take those laws and we apply them to our modern-day experiences, our modern-day issues, our modern-day problems, and we use them as wisdom to guide our lives. So a lot of times, people would do this. A rabbi would teach about the law, and a group of people would come and they would ask questions. Well, what do you think the law means? What does this law mean? How should we apply this today? You know, there's laws in Leviticus that have no application to me. As far as I know, my ox is never going to gore my neighbor to death. And if it does, I doubt it will happen twice. But is there wisdom there for me? About the way I do things? That yes, accidents happen, but if you don't take measures, you don't put your dog on a leash. You know, if it bit a kid once, that's okay, whatever, if stuff happens. You bit a kid twice, 3 times, 4 times, it might be a you problem. Right? Oh, there's wisdom here. So people would get together and they would talk. And they would unpack the law and try to understand what would God do in this situation, in this circumstance. But there was another group of people. These were called the Sadducees and a lot of Samaritans who rejected, they kind of went with the literal 611. Those are God's word. Those are the rules. We don't add to them and we don't take away from them. If it doesn't apply, if there's no guidance for it, then we get to do whatever we want. If God didn't tell us the rule, it's up to us to figure it out. All right? There were people that had these kind of conversations all the time. Jesus was a part of the oral tradition. That's why Jesus would often get asked questions about his interpretation of the law. How do you understand the Sabbath? How do you understand giving? Who should we give to? Caesar? Should we pay taxes? And Jesus would give his opinion. Now, this kind of looks like this. Sometimes I'll do things with my kids. I'll give them a rule that is temporary. Like if I'm driving, trying to find my way around town, maybe I'm like lost, which never happens. I never get lost. But if I did, and my kids are in the backseat yelling at each other, I might say, no more talking. No more. Right? Then we find our way out of town. I get back on the right track. And I might turn to my daughter. This has never happened. And I might say, hey, how was your day today? And she goes, you told me I'm not allowed to talk. She's right. She's taking the law literally. Now, is that what I meant for her? Did I mean never speak again? When I teach my kids not to cross the road without holding my hand, do I expect that when they're 35, they're going to call me and be like, Dad, I need to cross the street. Will you come over and hold my hand? But when Jesus gets asked this question, he lets the man answer it. He asks him, what's your thought? And the lawyer quotes 2 verses. He quotes Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. This isn't profound. This wasn't the first time anyone had heard this. Jesus knew this was the answer, and he knew that this guy who studied the law was going to say this. This was everyone's understanding. But just because you know something, or just because you say something, doesn't mean you live that thing out. And so, like on Sunday, when we share our mission statement, it is one thing for us to say those words. And it's a good thing for us to remind each other and to say those words and be reminded that that is our mission. You don't get bonus points in heaven for saying it. There is something to living those words out, putting them into practice. And that's when the second question comes. Who is my neighbor? What he's really asking is, how far does my love have to extend? How far do I need to love you? Where can I draw the line when it comes to loving others? This is where Jesus begins to tell our parable this morning. And I want to remind you that parables are a form of indirect communication. They're supposed to get past our defenses. They're supposed to challenge our assumptions. So there's something about this parable that is going to challenge this man. Challenge the assumptions about what a neighbor is and who his neighbors are, and help him to understand something new. Because Jesus could have very easily just said this. If he wanted to, he could have said, everyone. And we have a much shorter book of Luke, and it would be a lot easier to memorize that verse. He could have just said, who is my neighbor? Everyone is your neighbor. You get it? It's true. It's the point. But he's doing something else. In fact, Jesus is changing the question altogether. Jesus isn't teaching him who his neighbor is. He's asking him, will you be a neighbor? Are you willing to be someone's neighbor? I was, in one of the books I was studying, this guy, Klein Snodgrass, I've used his name before, and I just love his name. He writes about this parable. The parable of the Good Samaritan is annoying because it will not let us avert our eyes. We are forced to see the problems in the world around us. We can't just ignore the things that are happening around us. This parable challenges us to see. And so the first point we have this morning, if you're taking notes on your note page, is that neighbors see what others miss. Neighbors see what other people miss. In verse 30, Jesus begins the parable. It says, in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by him on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. This parable begins with three men going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. We have the man who is beaten and left for dead, and we have a priest, and we have a Levite. Now, they are literally going down, because Jerusalem is on a mountain. Jerusalem is 2,700 feet above sea level. And Jericho, a very nearby town, is 800 feet below sea level. So to get there, you are going down. And it's a desert road. There are not inns, there's no buildings, there's no safe places. In fact, it's rocks and crags and cactuses and bushes everywhere. It was a common road for people to be walking on and get attacked, get mugged, get kidnapped. Now, many priests lived in Jericho. It was more expensive to live in Jerusalem. It was more difficult. It was a big city, but it wasn't big enough. But also, the priests kind of wanted to not live in the place they worked. So they would live in Jericho, and so would the Levites. And so they might come up to the city for the 5 or 6 day shift that they would work at the temple, and then they would leave and they would walk back down the mountain and go home. Now these two men are religious elites. They both see a man who's been beaten to an inch of his life, and they're going home. They're not going to the temple, which if they were, maybe you could make this excuse that we've all made. I'm really, really busy. I saw someone broken down on the side of the road, but I'm the pastor and I need to be at church to preach my sermon. So so I couldn't stop. Somebody else would have to take care of it. They don't get to make that excuse. They're going home. Their job, their week is done. It's the weekend. They're ready to have some fun. They're not too busy to stop. There's something else happening. In fact, it's not their busyness, it's not their schedule, it's their religion that keeps them from helping this man. They don't help them because they know that there are rules about purity. If they touch a bleeding man, they will have to go through a week-long process of ritual purification before they can go back into the temple. They know that if they were to check on this man and he happened to be dead, that process would be even longer. So it's easier just not to see. To avert your eyes. Pretend the problem isn't yours. Now, this story begins, it kind of sets up like a bad joke. A priest, a Levite, and something walk into a bar, right? But this was a common form of rabbinic teaching. This is a very normal way that a rabbi would set up one of these stories. Jesus used this quite often. But here's the thing. The setup is typically something like this. A priest and a Levite don't do the right thing. But a commoner does. An Israelite, a baker, a shepherd does do the right thing. And for people, that's a huge twist. That a priest and a Levite would miss an opportunity to serve God, but a shepherd would do it? That's amazing. But Jesus doesn't choose an Israelite. He doesn't choose a fellow Jew. He takes the shock level up to 11. Because our second point this morning is that neighbors cross boundaries that others won't. Jesus continues, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Now, if this parable is just about being a nice person, being a kind stranger, like all those headlines point to, then Jesus could have chosen anyone to be the third character. Jesus was very specific in choosing a Samaritan. And in fact, by choosing a Samaritan, Jesus probably chose the most controversial person he could have. There was no one that Jews hated more than Samaritans. These were not just bad friends, they were enemies. Honestly, if Jesus would have said it was a Gentile, it would have been easier for his listeners to accept. An unbeliever, a pagan, because at least they don't know better. But a Samaritan is a bloodshed. You see, the conflict between Jews and Samaritans went back centuries. All the way to the time when Israel split into two kingdoms. Israel was in the north, and Judah is in the south. When the northern kingdom fell to Assyria in 722 BC, many Israelites were taken away as slaves into Assyria. And Assyria also brought many foreigners to live in the northern kingdom. Over time, those who remained intermarried with the newcomers, creating a mixed people who became known as Samaritans. Now, the Jews from the southern kingdom of Judah saw the Samaritans as racially impure and spiritually compromised. These are people who had blended the worship of Yahweh with pagan practices. Meanwhile, the Samaritans, they claimed that they were the true keepers of the law. And that, in fact, they set up their own temple on Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem and said, if God really resides in this temple, and if you go to Jerusalem to worship, you're not worshiping the right God. By Jesus' day, the hatred ran deep. Jews and Samaritans avoided each other entirely. They didn't share meals. They didn't drink from the same wells. They didn't even walk on the same roads. In fact, Jews would often take a much longer road around Samaria to get to the northern land of Galilee, because they would rather go a long way than walk through Samaria. But Jesus makes the Samaritan a hero. He turns centuries of prejudice and hate and bad blood on its head in order to show us what a true neighbor looks like. Now, to call someone a good Samaritan in Jesus' day sounded like an oxymoron. There weren't good Samaritans. That wasn't a thing. The idea that we would have hospitals named Good Samaritan is crazy. There was no such thing. It would be like an Ohio State fan having their life saved by a Michigan. Some of us would say, just let me die. Or it would be like a Ukrainian villager's life being saved by a Russian soldier. Or a Jewish woman being saved by a member of Hamas. Or a far-right American being saved by a far-left politician. And so on and so forth throughout time. It is our worst. Whoever the person out there that we hate the most, the other, the real other, the other that we exclude when we say, love God, love others. We say yes, except for them, because there's no way they can deserve it. There's no such thing as a good member of the ones. They can't do good. It's impossible. Don't make me believe that they can. Are you starting to see how controversial this story actually is? Why would Jesus choose a Samaritan when he could have just, if he was just trying to teach us to be nice to each other, to stop on the side of the road and fix someone's tire, then he could have used anyone. Why would he choose the one person that would leave everybody in the room with a pit in their stomach and their mind filled with anger and thinking to themselves, you can't mean what you said. You don't know what they've done to me. You don't know how they've hurt me. You don't know the things that I've seen. There is no redemptive quality. There is nothing good in them. Love, according to Jesus, does not allow limits on the definition of neighbor. We can't put limits on who is my neighbor. But just like our mission statement here at Church of the Palms, and like Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18, our love must be more than a slogan. Our love must be more than just words. Our love must be more than just feelings. Our love must be put into action. And that's why our third point this morning is that neighbors sacrifice for others. In verse 35 it says, the next day Jesus took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any expense you may have. Which of these 3, Jesus asks, do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert of the law replied, the one who had mercy. You notice he can't even bring himself to say the name the Samaritan. He couldn't do it. The one who showed mercy. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now, it's interesting to note, the priest and the Levite. A priest was someone who led worship in the temple, and they were responsible for the sacrificial system. So they were kind of the spiritually elite. And Levites were people who spent their entire lives, from the time they were born, being raised to take care of the temple. It was their familial responsibility to care for the temple. They were the ones who came in and cleaned it. And in order to enter into the temple each day, they had to make sure that they were ritually pure. These were two very, very scripturally sound people. They knew their Bible. And every day, for their entire lives, twice a day, they would recite Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, what some of us might know as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. They would repeat that twice a day, every day, their entire lives. You guys only have to hear us do our mission statement on Sundays once. You're getting a break. I should make you guys all start repeating it every day. Now the Hebrew word, Shema, means to hear. But remember when Jesus started one of his parables and said, or he ended it with saying, he who has ears, let him hear? And we talked about how hearing is one thing, but doing is another. And this word Shema isn't just allow waves of sound to enter into your ears and be processed by your brain, but it implies action. It's actually hear and obey. As you repeat these words, hear them and do them. So these two men, who at least once that day had already repeated those words in a prayer to God, walked past a dying man on the side of the road and asked themselves, can I love God with all my heart, with all my soul, and with all my strength, and ignore this dying man? And their conclusion was yes. Their conclusion was yes. Their religious obedience kept them from loving their neighbor. That sounds crazy, but it can be true of us too. When we draw so many lines in the sand and so many boxes and so many rules that you're not allowed to cross, we won't go there, we won't associate with them, we won't be seen with that, it can get in the way of the true law, which is love. I remember when I was a kid, maybe 11 or 12, my sister had just gotten her license. She was in a thing after school called show choir. So they would have practice like 4 hours after school. So she was coming home late one night, and she was taking some friends home from practice, and my dad got a call. This is like early cell phone days. Like they were like this big. And he gets this call that Erin had been in a really bad accident. She was going through a light, and somebody ran the light and just sideswiped her. And she spun out at least 3 or 4 times. And she was stuck on the side of the road, and she calls and she says, Dad, I'm scared. I don't know what to do. There's cops everywhere. They're asking me questions. Now, my dad was a pretty good driver most of the time. He obeyed the law for the most part. He wasn't a speeder. He didn't go out and race people. I never saw him drag race in our economy-sized van that I think before. So maybe that's why you were a good guy, I don't know. But he wasn't one to break the law. But that day when he told me to get in the car, in a voice that I'd never heard before, that told me I need to get in the car, like, I'd never heard my dad talk that way. I got in the car, and he broke every law I've ever heard. There was no seatbelt. There were no stoplights. He was driving 75 down Coleraine Avenue at 7 o'clock at night. And at one point, he mounted the curb, drove through a parking lot, went through the grass divider between another parking lot to get to the corner where my sister was. Because when someone you love is hurting, the law suddenly means a lot less. And suddenly love supersedes the law. And maybe he deserved a ticket and he would have been happy to pay. But the reality is, I think if what happened that day was a cop saw what he was doing, he would have let that cop follow him all the way to the accident site, and they would have said, you know what? We understand. This is your baby girl. You need to be here. There are times when our obedience can keep us from being people of God. We can't let our religious duties keep us from helping others, from loving others. Sometimes being a person of love might mean you'll walk into that place you never thought you'd walk into. I won't be caught dead in a bar. But the person I love is in there, and they're drinking their sorrows away, and I need to go there. I won't be caught dead with a street person. And I might kick down the door to a brothel and find them on the road. But what if it's not your love? What if it's an enemy? Will love compel you to kick that door? To be seen in a place where you never will be seen before. To do things you would have never done before. I'm not saying that the laws in the Old Testament don't matter, but just like Jesus said to the Pharisees, if your child fell into a well on the Sabbath day, would you not reach in and pull them out? You would break the Sabbath to save your child. And you'd be right to do it. And then Jesus healed a man and let him walk out. This was actually part of the oral law, was that when it came to saving a life, all purity and ritual laws were to be suspended. And you were supposed to do anything and everything to save someone. In this story, the Samaritan would have been the least likely person. In their understanding of the law, their traditional reading of the law, there were no exceptions. There was no grace for breaking a rule. But the Samaritan sees this man, and he risks judgment, he risks rejection, he risks uncleanliness to save the life of a stranger. Love that costs us nothing isn't love. It's just intimate. It's just intimate. It's just a feeling. Now, the Samaritan in our story doesn't just help the man, but he goes above and beyond. He ends up paying for the man's care, setting him up in a good situation where he can recover, and telling the people who are caring for him, I'll pay for whatever it takes to get this guy back. Loving people is expensive. Loving people costs us. It costs us time. It'll cost us comfort. It'll cost us money, it'll cost us pride, and it might even cost us what we think is our religiously proper. To be a person of love might make you do outrageous things. Things that your church friends might look at you and judge you for. As we kind of conclude this morning, I'm going to have the band come forward. And I